Thanks for coming. For some of us, it's an adventure to be here in Murray Hall in the, I don't know, history department or whatever this is, but they have a nice lecture hall, so we're happy to borrow it from them for this hour and a half. I'm Sarah Stroud. I'm director of the Parr Center for Ethics, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our first speaker event of this academic year. The Parr Center is, just for those of you who don't already know about us, the Parr Center is Carolina's focal point for inquiry into and discussion of ethical questions. We've been here since 2004, and we put on a range of programs, of which our vibrant speaker series is always a highlight. So before I introduce today's speaker, let me just mention, now that our series is underway for the fall term, what else is on tap. We've got, next week actually, Thursday, October 13th, we have Michael Schur, creator and showrunner of The Good Place, Emmy Award writer and producer, not just of The Good Place, but of some other great shows, Parks and Recreation, The Office, general famous guy, who's also a good guy who has written now a book on ethics. So we're delighted to welcome him. That's going to be next Thursday at 5. That is going to be in the auditorium at the Student Union. Our next speaker after that is on November 1st. We're really pleased to bring back this year our lunchtime talks on ethics, which we obviously had to put on the shelf during the pandemic, but they are back now. So Ethics Around the Table is the name of that series. It is literally around the table. We serve lunch, everybody eats lunch. And we're delighted to have my new colleague in the philosophy department, Rosalind Chaplin, speaking to us on November the 1st, 12:30, Ethics Around the Table. 1 week later, we're gonna have Professor Robin Chung of the University of Glasgow, who's going to give a public lecture entitled The Power of Solidarity, How You and I Can Change the World. So that should also be a great event. All of that's coming up in the coming weeks. But for today, I'm so pleased to welcome Keshav Singh, UNC alumnus in 2020. Dr. Singh is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in the philosophy department. His primary areas of research within philosophy are ethics and epistemology, but his research interests range broadly into social and political philosophy, philosophy of race, philosophy of mind and action, moral psychology, 20th century philosophy, and Sikh philosophy, which is going to be the topic of his talk today. So just to review the format of our Parr Center Presents events, Dr. Singh will deliver his lecture. We'll go right to discussion and Q&A after that. Everyone should feel very free to ask their questions or bring up their points or comments for Dr. Singh. We will end no later than 6:30, at which point everybody's welcome to join us in some refreshments, which are up at the top of the auditorium. So let's give a warm UNC welcome back to campus for Keshav Singh.
Thanks so much, thanks Sarah for that introduction. Can everyone hear me without the mic? Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Good. Well, it's really nice to be back here. I did my PhD here, finished only a couple years ago, so my time at Carolina is still very fresh in my mind. I miss it very much, and I take every opportunity I can to come back. So I was very glad to be invited to give this talk. So the title of this talk is Oneness and the Foundations of Ethics. And just to sort of give a little background of what this comes out of, something is happening in philosophy right now where people who study Western philosophy, who may also have some familiarity with some other tradition, maybe a tradition they were raised in, are being given the space to say, hey, maybe that tradition has something interesting to contribute philosophical conversation. And so I have recently started talking about and philosophically exploring the tradition I was raised in, which is Sikhism. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about that, but also talk a lot about Western philosophy, canonical Western philosophy. And I'm going to suggest that some of there's one example at least where looking at Sikh philosophy can enrich how we do moral philosophy, sort of broadening our perspective, and how this can actually help solve a problem that's been very recalcitrant in the history of moral philosophy. And that problem is called the why be moral problem. So, or the why be moral question, because it is a question, right? So this is one of the boldest and most recalcitrant questions in ethics. It goes back at least to Plato. And the question is basically, if we posit some sort of universal moral system, the kind that we see in Western philosophy, the moral systems of philosophers like Mill or Kant or anything defended by pretty much any contemporary moral philosopher, this question arises, which is, how could this universal morality have any rational authority? And the reason that question arises is morality, universal morality, is not just all about us. It's about what we owe to others. It's about how we treat other people. And so, according to pretty much any plausible moral theory, morality sometimes requires doing things for the sake of others. So then the question is, how can we have reason to be moral when morality requires a departure from our own self-interest? In other words, if I would be better served by just ignoring or flouting what morality tells me to do in a particular situation, then why shouldn't I just do that, right? Why shouldn't I just do whatever is in my self-interest? Why should I care about other people for their own sake? Lots of answers have been proposed to this question, of course. But just to sort of present the question a little more, this is a question that's been discussed throughout the history of philosophy. Maybe some of you will be familiar, well, I know some of you will be familiar with this. So a couple of places that this shows up. One is in Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes, would be the fool. So Hobbes says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there's no such thing as justice." And sometimes also with his tongue, seriously alleging that every man's conservation and contentment, being committed to his own care, there could be no reason why every man might not do what he thought conduced thereunto. And therefore also to make or not make, keep or not keep covenants was not against reason when it conduced to one's benefit, right? So this is the presentation of the why be moral problem, right? If there's some case where it turns out to be to my advantage to break a promise or to deceive someone or to manipulate someone, then why would it not be reasonable for me to just do that? This is a sort of challenge to the authority of morality. Another place this pops up is Hume's sensible knave. So Hume says, a sensible knave, in particular incidents, may think that an act of iniquity or infidelity will make a considerable addition to his fortune, without causing any considerable breach in the social union and confederacy. That honesty is the best policy may be a good general rule, but is liable to many exceptions. And he, it may perhaps be thought, conducts himself with most wisdom, who observes the general rule and takes advantage of all the exceptions, right? So the sensible knave is a character who questions, well, why wouldn't it be reasonable for me to follow the moral rules when it's in my self-interest, but if I can find cases where it would genuinely be in my self-interest to break them, I wouldn't get in trouble, I wouldn't get punished, I wouldn't have social sanction leveled against me, then why shouldn't I do that? Wouldn't it be rational for me to take advantage of these exceptions whenever they are to my own benefit, right? So this is the very same problem that Hobbes talked about. Now, there are a lot of different solutions proposed to this problem. I, of course, won't go through them all. That would take, the time of an entire course to go through. But I'll just mention one kind of commonly proposed solution that I think is very unsatisfying to many of us. And it is the direction that both Hobbes and Hume go in to answer this why be moral question and solve this problem. So this commonly proposed solution is basically to deny that it can ever be in our self-interest not to be moral. And a lot of sort of proposed solutions to the why be moral problem are just more or less sophisticated versions of this strategy of saying, well, it's always in our self-interest to be good people. Maybe there could be cases where, lying or breaking a promise or manipulating someone would be in the short term to one's advantage, but being the kind of person who does those things is not going to be good for you, and so you should never want to be that kind of person. You should always try to be a good person because that will lead to the best life for you overall. And this is basically a way of sort of constructing reasons to be moral out of our self-interest, right? Well, it's better for everyone to cooperate, right? And so the authority of morality comes from this need for cooperation. We should be moral because it would be bad for everyone not to be, right? So if I cheat and lie and steal and so on and so forth, that is, because we live in a society, ultimately not going to be good for me. And we live in a society we live in a society precisely because we need to cooperate, right? So Hobbes talks about this sort of hypothetical state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short. And so the idea behind this is, we need to cooperate, we need to form societies, and this ultimately sort of undergirds the authority of morality. It's sort of constructed out of self-interest. Hume thinks something similar, won't get into the details, but Hume even says, if there were a person who were so powerful, so much more powerful than everyone else that they didn't have need for cooperation or need for other people, then actually that person would have no reason to be moral. To me, that's not a very satisfying response to the why be moral problem. It doesn't seem to get things quite right to suggest that morality's reason-giving force is somehow derivative of the reason-giving force of self-interest. Maybe that's a satisfying solution to some, but I've never found it to be a satisfying solution. And so that's part of why this why be moral problem has bothered me for a long time. Back to when I was studying philosophy in college. So two of the reasons this kind of solution seems unsatisfying to me are, first it seems like there are lots of cases where being immoral is beneficial, and it's not always plausible, I think, to suggest that one couldn't be the kind of person who generally tries to be a good person, generally follows moral rules, and sort of has respect for them, but if there's a tempting enough case where you could really benefit by breaking some moral rule, by flouting morality, that might just break through whatever moral virtues you've developed, especially if you develop those ultimately with your own self-interest in mind. So one example of this is Plato's Ring of Gyges, which is also a very famous philosophical thought experiment. This shepherd in Lydia finds a ring where he puts it on, it turns him invisible. And then the sort of question is, okay, so now he's kind of become immune to all of these downsides to acting immorally in terms of his self-interest. So then, now the circumstances change. Even if he was genuinely a very virtuous person before, well, why not just go nuts now? You know, why not just do all of the really bad things he was always tempted to do that it seems like would benefit him? Before, it wasn't true that those things would benefit him, because he might have gotten caught and punished, but now he could get away with all of it, right? So it seems like any case where someone could act immorally with impunity is going to be a case where morality and self-interest come apart. And because it's so easy to imagine such cases, I don't think it's all that plausible to try to account for why we should be moral in terms of self-interest. The other thing is it just seems to be the wrong kind of reason, right? So Kant has this famous example of the prudent shopkeeper who charges fair prices, not for any moral reasons, but just because he knows that it conduces to his self-interest. It'll get him more business in the long run. So this is a case where Kant says the prudent shopkeeper is acting in accordance with duty, but not from duty, and so his actions lack any moral worth. If we account for reasons to be moral purely in terms of self-interest, it seems like we can't really draw this distinction between someone who does the right thing for the right reasons and someone who doesn't. Or at least we would have to do a bunch of really sophisticated philosophical work to try to account for that difference. So the point here is that it seems like truly vindicating the authority of morality requires accounting for other regarding reasons. Reasons to act for the sake of others, not for the sake of ourselves. And so the question becomes, why think we have any such reasons, right? So why should the interests or needs or goals of someone else generate any reasons for me to do anything? After all, you know, there's somebody else over there, and I am me, right? So why shouldn't I only care about my own goals, interests, and needs? Now, part of why this problem arises and seems so difficult, seems to require so much sophisticated philosophical work to solve, is there's a sort of presupposition at the heart of the problem, which is the fact that I'm me means that it just sort of follows from that my interests or needs or goals generate reasons for me to pursue them. And that we would need to sort of bridge some kind of gap between self and other to explain why the interests or goals or needs of others might generate reasons for me. So the presupposition here is that we can sort of take the rationality of self-interest for granted. It just kind of falls out of what it is to be you, that you have reason to promote your own goals and interests, right? It follows from the fact that you want to do something, that you have a reason to do it. But the fact that someone else wants something, we might think, well, there needs to be much more of a case made there to show that someone else's wanting something means anything for what I should be. So there are attempts to bridge this gap that don't just consist in kind of trying to construct morality out of self-interest like Hobbes and Hume do. Famously, Kant, tries to bridge this gap with the idea of the categorical imperative. The idea, which I'll come back to, that it's somehow inconsistent to value my own ends without also valuing the ends of others. That I'm sort of making an exception of myself in some way that's irrational. I actually think this is a really promising strategy, but I think it's made a lot more difficult by a presupposition of most of Western philosophy, which I'll call strong individualism. So what I'm going to suggest is that there's kind of a tension that arises between the desire in Western philosophy to account for a universal morality on one hand, and this acceptance of strong individualism. And that tension is what makes the why be moral question so hard to answer. Not necessarily impossible, but difficult. Okay, so what is strong individualism? Strong individualism is sort of an ethical and sort of a metaphysical doctrine that basically says that each person is a fundamentally separate individual, not part of any unified whole. I am fundamentally a discrete individual being. And so there's no real metaphysical overlap between me and you, between any two people. They're sort of wholly discrete. And I think this strong individualism, the reason I say it's partly a metaphysical doctrine and partly an ethical one, is there's sort of this idea that the rationality of pursuing my own self-interest doesn't need to be accounted for because of these sort of strict boundaries of self. The reason that it just sort of falls out of the fact that I'm me, that I have reasons to pursue my own interests, but it doesn't fall out of anything about you that I have reasons to pursue or to help you pursue your own interests. That sort of asymmetry seems to be related to this idea that we're all fundamentally separate. So that's the idea that I'm calling strong individualism. Now, strong individualism can seem like just sort of an obvious fact of existence, but it's worth noting that a lot of historians and cultural theorists look at it as a sort of aberration of the West, especially one that was sort of codified during the Enlightenment and sort of, moving past communitarian ideas toward this kind of individualism, what is supposed to have been a form of progress that actually helped us come up with universal morality, helped us come up with ideas of rights and things like that. I'm not a historian or a cultural theorist, so I'm just kind of saying, well, people say this, which you'll have to just spot me. But people do say this, so it is, I think, there is something to the idea that not every society has adopted this strong individualism to the degree that Western societies have, and certainly that Western philosophy has really focused on this kind of strong individualism, much more so than a lot of other traditions. That'll be important in a little bit. So going back to this tension that I was talking about a minute ago, there's something sort of odd here about what individualism is supposed to do. So for a lot of European Enlightenment philosophers, we have these ideas of rights and freedoms that are sort of grounded in individualistic ideas, right? Doctrines of independence and separateness, and this is supposed to give rise to, explanations of why we have rights and why, other people can't just do whatever they want to us. This idea of the inviolability of the individual. So this separateness, for a lot of European philosophers, is supposed to actually make sense of morality. But it seems like this is precisely why there's a tension. One can come up with such explanations of universal morality in terms of rights and all of these concepts that don't necessarily presuppose, but at least in how they were discussed by a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, they're sort of tied up with these individualistic ideas. And so then we have this situation where the very structure, right, this structure of separate, discrete individuals that's supposed to make sense of morality in terms of things like rights, also makes it a lot harder, I think, to see why we should actually care about morality. So, of course, I, the individual, have reason to want my rights respected by others. But why does that give others reasons to respect my rights? Of course, we can't just say, well, because they're rights and the nature of rights is that other people have to respect my rights. Then we're just assuming what we're trying to prove here. The question is, how do we bridge this self-other gap, right? Once we assume that there is a fundamental separation between individuals. So Mill says that over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And that seems plausible. But that doesn't include any explanation of why anyone else should care about this, right? Why shouldn't someone else say, yeah, well, that's fine, but you're you, and you have, whatever facts about you there are generate reasons for you to do things, but they don't generate any reasons for me to do anything, so I'll just do whatever I want. That's in my self-interest. I mean, that doesn't seem like the right way of thinking about things, but the whole point of the challenge is to get us to sort of produce a justification for something that already seemed true to us. That's what we need to do to answer the why be moral question. And I haven't proved that, there's no successful attempt at answering the why be moral question in Western philosophy. I just think that this tension that I've talked about makes it difficult to do so. It means that our attempts require a lot of philosophical sophistication, and they are, while not necessarily unsuccessful, I think not likely to be successful, at least. Okay, so now, what if there were a different way of looking at the world that made the why be moral question easier to answer? That's what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk suggesting. So now we're going to have a very abrupt transition from talking a whole bunch about my sort of potted history of Western moral philosophy to something that's probably a lot less familiar to everyone in the audience, which is Sikh philosophy, something that I've started working on after realizing that maybe there could be some real contributions here if we put these things in conversation. So that's what I'm going to try to do now. Okay. So the Western idea of self-interest presupposes these deep and rigid boundaries of self. And these are rejected by many Eastern philosophical traditions. I'm only going to talk about the one I know, but it sort of seems to be a general trend in Eastern philosophical traditions that they are not wedded to this kind of individualism. And a lot of them have some kind of idea of oneness, an idea that's often very hard to explicate, partly because where you get it is not, in sort of the kinds of philosophical texts we're used to that have very clearly laid out arguments. But you can find in a variety of different Eastern traditions this idea of a fundamental oneness to everything. And so it just sort of occurred to me one day, why not explore whether this idea of oneness, as opposed to strong individualism, can help with the why be moral question. Okay. So, just some quick background here. For anyone who isn't familiar with Sikhism, which is the philosophical tradition that I was raised in, philosophical and spiritual tradition, it's a tradition that was founded in South Asia roughly 500 years ago, so a little bit before the Enlightenment, but one that sort of developed a lot of ideas that are similar to Enlightenment ideas, ideas of sort of universal morality for one thing, ideas that discrimination is wrong, that everyone is equal, those kinds of ideas. But it, as I'm going to suggest, did so in maybe a better way by not relying on strong individualism. So a couple core spiritual tenets, I'm not gonna, this isn't a religion lecture, so I'm not gonna get too far into these, but these two tenets are sort of important for getting a basic idea of what we're working with here. So one is that the divine is a universal, all-encompassing oneness, and spiritual enlightenment comes from recognizing and connecting with this oneness. Sounds good, so it's a little vague at this point, so I'm going to try to say more about what this is supposed to mean. So one thing, though, that's clear, I think, is that Sikh metaphysics rejects the kind of strong individualism I've been talking about, that I've been claiming makes the why be moral problem so difficult to solve. The reason it rejects this is the story of reality that we have here is, and I'm not a metaphysician, so I'm going to do some hand-wavy metaphysics here for a second. The idea, as I understand it, is that there are two different levels of reality. And the fundamental level of reality, what we might call ultimate reality, it is one that doesn't include any separation. There are no discrete individuals at this level of reality. Everything is in some sense one. And then there's this less fundamental level of reality, the level of reality that we experience on a day-to-day basis, where we are these discrete, separate individuals. So, two levels of reality here. This means that while at this level of reality, we are separate, discrete individuals, any sense of fundamental separation between us is an illusion. This is a really important part of Sikh philosophy. So, since I gave you quotes from Hobbes and Hume, here is a quote from Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. Sikh scripture is about 1,400 pages of poetry, so you're not going to get things that look quite like Western philosophy, but I think this is a pretty instructive set of lines in translation, of course. Guru Nanak says, "The illusion of duality dwells in our minds. We are destroyed by lust, anger, and pride. Whom should I call the other? There is none. The same divine unity resides within us all." So this is, I think, a pretty good expression of the gist of this idea of oneness, and that at the level of ultimate reality, there isn't really a separation between individuals. So while individuality is real, right? So this is not like a kind of no self view, as some people interpret Buddhism to give. It's more complicated. The idea is that there is a reality to individuality. And so there is a reality to what we experience when we experience ourselves as discrete individuals separate from others, but it's a relatively shallow reality. So perceiving the true nature of reality, perceiving ultimate reality requires transcending this shallow individualism. That's going to be very important. So we have these two levels, right? We have the derivative level of reality, the one we're ordinarily conscious of, where we're separate, discrete individuals. There's a duality of self and other. And from this perspective, I think it makes sense to accord particular importance to our own interests, needs, or goals. But then we have this other ultimate level of reality, the fundamental level of reality, where there are no discrete individuals, there's no duality of self and other. And it, of course, wouldn't make sense to think of our own interests, needs, and goals as having particular importance, because at this level of reality, there is no individual. Okay, so that's sort of the metaphysical side of things. Now, looking at what Sikhism says about ethics, I'm not going to give you a whole ethical theory here because that would take its own talk, but a central idea here is this idea, there's this concept of home, which is very difficult to translate adequately. I've written about this a little bit about why the translations such as ego, egotism, or individuation don't really fully capture things, but it's this sort of vice. I mean, it's the vice, the moral vice according to Sikhism, but what it consists in is actually a kind of failure of perception or failure of understanding. So what this vice consists in is the misidentification of the level of reality in which we're all separate with ultimate reality, right? So thinking of this as ultimate reality is ultimately sort of the source of all evil, according to Sikhism. And that's because that includes this sort of false perception of a fundamental self-other duality, which from the Sikh perspective is bound to result in our failing to recognize the significance of others. Failing to recognize that they have the very same significance as we do, because ultimately we're all one. This love of duality, right, is referred to as a disease that tears you away. This love of duality is a disease that tears you away from ultimate reality. So, basically, the idea here is that in being attached to this self-other duality, we think of ourselves as having a special importance apart from others. And this is sort of the main barrier to a kind of enlightenment or a kind of understanding how things really are ultimately. Those who recognize oneness renounce their love of duality. The one itself is everything, there's no other at all. This is another quote from Sikh scripture. So this, I think, is starting to get us somewhere where we might actually be able to make this problem that I spent the first part of the talk raising easier or just less of a problem. So, according to Sikh philosophy, recognizing the ultimate reality of oneness requires a couple things. One thing is spiritual contemplation, meditation, things like that. But that's not good enough, right? So you can't go off and just meditate on the nature of ultimate reality and achieve enlightenment. You have to practice oneness by enacting it in your treatment of others. This is a really central idea. So it's kind of a way, the idea is that there's a way of coming to perceive things or understand things that you can only accomplish by doing things, which might seem a little odd, right? We might think like, perception or understanding is this sort of passive thing, whereas, doing things is this active thing. But the idea here is you really actually can't come to understand the way the world really works, ultimately, without enacting it in your treatment of others. So, in order to actually recognize the sense in which there is this underlying oneness to everyone and everything, one has to treat other people as having the very same significance that oneself has. One has to treat others as equal, as bearers of the very same, whatever it is that makes me morally significant, everyone else has it. It's not the fact that I'm me, that's the important thing. Because ultimately, that is a very shallow fact about reality. So going back to the why be moral question, how can we have reason to be moral when morality requires a departure from our own self-interest? Well, from a Sikh perspective, the very idea of there being a self-interest apart from others is an embodiment of a perspective that's sort of constrained by this shallow level of reality. So the shift in perspective here is that it no longer even makes sense to try to construct morality out of self-interest, right? So Western philosophers like Hobbes and Hume, as I said earlier, try to bridge the gap between self-interest and morality by explaining reasons to be moral in terms of a self-interest that's sort of already presupposed to have rational authority. This is sort of being turned on its head. Actually, the idea of self-interest only makes sense if we presuppose the authority, the rational authority of other regarding reasons. So the idea here is, once we shift from thinking of our significance as coming from our status as individuals to thinking of our significance as coming from being part of this ultimate oneness, there isn't really a why be moral question to ask anymore. Our reasons for acting are fundamentally other regarding. And reasons of self-interest would actually be the ones that enter the picture non-fundamentally. And any special reasons of self-interest would be the ones that sort of require some sophisticated philosophical work to explain. So, general moral reasons can actually be presupposed, I think, on this framework in just the same way that reasons of self-interest are presupposed on a framework of strong individualism. So we have kind of the opposite order here. And I think this is a really promising way of just sort of getting rid of this nagging question of why we should care about morality. Why not just flout morality and do whatever is in our self-interest? It just doesn't make sense from this perspective of oneness, I think. Now, one thing you might wonder is whether this is sort of getting too impersonal. So one thing that's, well, this is not exactly a solution to the why be moral problem, but it's sort of related. Derek Parfit famously argued in Reasons and Persons that because personal identity is just a matter of psychological connectedness, it's not very deep, right? The self is not very deep. And this tells, Parfit thought, in favor of a more impersonal ethics. You might think that that's sort of a way of maybe solving the why be moral problem because, okay, we're all just sort of bundles of psychological states, and my relation to my future self might be not much stronger than my relation to some other person, and so we should sort of take everyone's, we should take everyone's psychological states, their experiences, to have the same significance. This is a sort of, perfect way of getting universal morality. But this can seem excessively impersonal, right? It can sort of, the worry here is that we're replacing the why be moral problem with a sort of why be personal problem, right? Why sort of care about particular other people ever, instead of just sort of seeing everyone as receptacles of, potential positive experiences or something like that. And so, we might worry that a focus on oneness yields a similar conclusion. Parfit, by the way, it seems, was somewhat inspired by certain interpretations of Buddhist philosophy in kind of making this move I was just talking about. But as I already said before, Sikhism, I think, is coming from a different place in not totally rejecting the idea of the reality of itself. So personal identity is not illusory. There's this sort of duality of perspectives, where we're at once all one, and then we can't really help but being embodied in these discrete consciousnesses. I mean, we can transcend that for, short periods of time by, engaging in certain kinds of practices. But in general, I can't stop experiencing everyone as discrete individuals, and that is real at a certain level of reality. So I think what this ultimately gets us is that the kind of enacting oneness that I talked about before has to take the form of something personally directed, where I recognize oneness by enacting it, and I enact oneness by treating particular others as having the same significance I do. And I think that's going to get us a very different structure than this kind of impersonal idea that everyone is just a sort of receptacle of experiences that are sort of interchangeable between people. There's more to say there, but I'll leave it at that for now, since I can't talk for several hours at length. So really quickly then, coming back to Kant, and Kant's answer to the why be moral question, this idea that it's inconsistent to recognize your own value as a rational being without recognizing that of others. In acting, I recognize my rational capacities as sort of having this importance, this significance, and so I have to recognize anyone else who has those capacities as having the same importance or significance, and so one is sort of making an exception of oneself by being immoral. Like I said before, I find this really plausible, but I also find the idea that individuals are fundamentally separate to sort of complicate this, because it seems that if there is that kind of radical separation, it seems at least intelligible to ask the question, why shouldn't I make an exception of myself? So I think the idea of fundamental oneness here that I've been talking about can actually help fill a gap here and explain why we should have this sort of reverence for others. Okay, so the final question, well, I'm sure I hope there'll be lots of questions, but the final question I want to consider is, why accept this framework, right? So if we can do all this stuff with the framework, that's great, but why should I think reality is actually like this, right? Haven't I just made a whole bunch of metaphysical claims and said, okay, this is what this particular philosophical / religious tradition says? But of course, you might wonder, why should I care what this particular religious or philosophical tradition says? What reason do I have to think that ultimate reality is like this? how much appeal does this solution really have if it relies on this metaphysical picture that's very peculiar? And I just want to suggest that we can answer this question with a sort of why not kind of question. Why not believe that reality is like this? In other words, why is the strong individualism of Western thought any more plausible? What reason do we actually have to think that we're all fundamentally separate? I mean, we have the reason that that's how reality is presented to us. But of course, as we now know, we have plenty of reason to think that the way reality presents itself to us is often misleading, right? And that such presentations can be shallow and limited. That there is much more to reality than just the way things seem to us at first. So even though we might seem to be all separate and discrete, and there's a sense in which we really are, we ought to take seriously the thought that that doesn't really say anything about what reality is fundamentally, ultimately like. So, to conclude, what I've tried to suggest here, or to explore, is that Western Enlightenment age philosophy has this tension, right, between strong individualism and universal morality, and this makes the why be moral question difficult to answer. Not necessarily impossible, I don't take myself to have shown that, but it at least makes it difficult to answer. It seems that answers from this perspective require a lot of philosophical gymnastics. And I've tried to suggest that this idea of oneness and the corresponding rejection of strong individualism that we can see by looking at Eastern traditions, like Sikhism, makes answering the why be moral question and accounting for universal morality much easier. You still have to do some work, work which I've tried to sort of suggest the structure of or the shape of, but I think a lot of gaps are filled by taking this perspective of oneness more seriously. And so all of this is to say, I think, or to support this larger point that the insights of these traditions should be taken much more seriously by Western moral philosophers in trying to solve the perennial problems of philosophy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, the floor is open for questions. I'm not going to try to keep a queue. I just will call on people, and then if I don't call on you, raise your hand again next time. Thomas.
Give me the hardest one first.
I wonder if you got the best view about what oneness comes down to that's most congenial to the overall project.
Yeah.
So the way you started out was that there's a difference between what's fundamental and what's non-fundamental.
Yeah.
That fundamentally we're all one, but not fundamentally individualism is true.
Right.
And that has more significance.
Yeah.
But it's also clear that wouldn't have more significance because the question is why do you think that morality primarily applies to the fundamental level? Because morality itself generally is not seen to be a fundamental feature of the world. So just take an example, like sort of a toy example of a non-Sikh tradition, oneness, where people sometimes think that the whole separation of all these, just like individuals, like conscious people, individuals like chairs, is not really a fundamental feature of the world. So like one toy example is this, like, quantum mechanics as this universal wave function, which is a global description of the world, and individual objects are just features of that global state. Nobody would normally think that that has moral significance.
Right.
Ultimately, all these things are part of or aspects of one global wave function.
Right.
Because the fundamental description of the world does not include morality. Morality only comes in later. And then you might wonder, okay, then maybe it also only applies primarily to that level of description of the world. Not the fundamental, but the derivative where it itself arises.
Yeah.
So I think it might be more congenial to not rely too heavily on the fundamental and non-fundamental distinction, but rather to make some sense in which it is actually just false that we are individuals, that we're totally separate creatures. It's of course hard to make sense of how that could be false, but I think that would be more congenial to the ethical project than the other project.
I see. Yeah, okay. So let me try something out here. I think that morality does arise on this view at the non-fundamental level, because morality is about how we relate to others, and there are no others at the fundamental level. But I was thinking it arises in the particular way it does at the non-fundamental level because of facts about the fundamental level of reality. So, of course, you're totally right that we can't just say, hey, there's a fundamental oneness to everything and have any moral significance. You know, there are lots of ways in which reality could be fundamentally unified that just seems to be totally morally irrelevant. So I think the thing that I was relying on here that needs to be true is that there is something about this fundamental level, about this fundamental oneness, that grounds the significance of anything. And so the idea is, you know, if the significance or importance of anything is grounded in some feature or, you know, arises in some way from something about the way in which things are ultimately one, which I haven't really specified that precisely, then we would sort of get this idea that it really does not make any sense for me to consider my own, you know, interests as significant without considering the interests of others as significant, if that significance itself comes from the fact that I am part of this fundamental oneness. So the thing that's sort of doing a lot of work here is this idea that the significance of anything comes from that fundamental level, but I still think morality would still arise at the non-fundamental level in the sense that it's hard to actually make sense of what morality would even be if there weren't others. So that's why I actually find this sort of this two-level picture of reality, as opposed to a picture on which it's just individualism is just wholly illusory, sort of uniquely promising for helping with this problem.
Shane.
So it seems you brought up Western philosophy and control of Spinoza. Very evidently has a complete analysis based off of the supposition that we have. And so I'm thinking about the different ways that you related the ethical activity. Spinoza has a similar system where it's about realizing the way in which we are holding through our reason faculties. Is there any reason to prefer the Sikh system over Spinoza's system in this case?
I mean, not necessarily other than I know it much better. But yeah, I mean, I'm really reluctant to say anything here because Spinoza is not one of the philosophers I know as well. I mean, you know, if it turns out that Spinoza is sort of an exception to this general trend I talked about in Western philosophy, I think that is great and that is better, you know, for the history of Western philosophy, and maybe it means we should, you know, pay more attention to Spinoza's ethics instead of, you know, spending so much time on Hume and Hobbes. I mean, you know, I went through all of grad school learning a lot about Hume and Hobbes and, you know, a variety of other early modern philosophers, and not all that much about Spinoza. So, you know, that tells you something about what we might emphasize, and maybe even within Western philosophy, our emphasis should be different.
Thanks so much, Keshav. It's great to see you.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, of course. So,
can I stand up for separateness for a moment? So I worry that the oneness talk kind of lends itself to discounting the reality of conflicts of interest. So I have some great students. Suppose one of them comes to me with an idea. I say, oh, that's a great idea. I'd like to publish that under my name. And my student will say, Meredith. Meredith says, but that's my idea. I would like to publish it under my name. I said, Meredith, you've not yet grasped fundamental reality, in which you and I are one. It doesn't matter whose name this goes under. I don't think that you're a fan of plagiarism, so I don't want to accuse you. But can you just tell me, like, from your point of view, what's wrong with that kind of parody argument? Right? Where I say, there's no conflict here because we're all one. You obviously don't want to say that. So, but tell me why not?
Yeah, I haven't totally spelled it out yet, but I tried to gesture at it with the discussion of Parr. That it has something to do with the fact that it's not wholly an illusion, right? Separateness is not wholly an illusion. It's a real part of reality and not one that can be discounted because, so one of the things that's interesting but also kind of hard to get one's mind around, and this is happening all the time as I try to actually look at Sikh philosophy from the perspective of somebody who grew up with that stuff but is 100% trained in Western analytic philosophy. There is this idea that I am somehow supposed to recognize oneness in the way I treat particular persons, and that I wouldn't actually be doing that in the right way by just treating everyone as these sort of interchangeable bearers of significance. Now, of course, in a sense, we're saying, okay, everyone has the very same significance, and that significance all comes out of the whole. But the fact of reality that we're sort of stuck in this mode of interacting with the world is supposed to be really important in the whole framework. It's supposed to be like a central feature of things that by being embodied in these, separate consciousnesses, we're somehow sort of condemned to experience oneness in a particularly human way, which involves, again, I'm sort of extrapolating from some things here and trying to make it all work from 1,400 pages of poetry. But that sort of are, given that we're sort of stuck in a sense here in this level of reality, the only way that we can sort of properly connect with that oneness is, this might seem paradoxical, treating each other as having, in a sense, individual importance, but the very same importance that we ourselves have. So it's like, it's very hard to actually put in a way that makes sense, but that there's supposed to be, again, this two-level feature of reality is supposed to be doing a lot of work in a way that a sort of more radical, you might think, departure from individualism, like, again, it's not the way that some people interpret Buddhist philosophy, where like, no, it's just completely an illusion that there are individuals. You can find, bits of Sikh scripture that criticizes this view and sort of suggests that, that would lead to a kind of like moral solipsism or something like that. So this is very vague, but yeah, what I can say is that the two-level structure of reality is supposed to be really doing a lot of work here.
I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
I was just wondering, I think you just touched on this, the idea that in order to practice a sense of oneness, we need to recognize oneness in other people and have that same significance, which essentially lends itself towards individuation. So I'm wondering how, in practice, Sikhism or this idea of oneness differs from Western moral practice, or if you're using this as an argumentation for just the existence of morality itself.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm focused on here is trying to sort of vindicate the rational authority of morality in a sort of unorthodox way. I don't know that when we actually apply this framework, it'll end up with that different of specific moral guidance from that of some Western theories. Like I actually, and I alluded to this a little bit at the end, thinking about things from a purely Western perspective, I'm very sympathetic to Kantian ethics, and I sort of see some pretty similar conclusions coming out of this way of looking at things. And as I suggested at the end, this way of looking at things might even be a way of sort of helping to bolster support for the idea that what makes wrong actions wrong is that in doing them one makes an exception of oneself. I've always found that quite plausible, and I think that although I haven't fully spelled it out, this framework might help show why that's the case and why we should actually care that we would be making an exception of ourselves and doing something wrong.
So I think that the idea of just the general nature of reality is really interesting, and I would like to part of like kind of redefining what we emphasize in Western philosophy, because I think that there is ways to do that, especially with like Socrates' idea with like justice and divinity. I feel like he does a good job of recognizing the individual level of difference and like every person in society performing but justice being like the culmination of everybody. So I feel like there are overlaps, they just aren't as emphasized.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if you like maybe
I don't disagree with that. I think there are, this is not so much a criticism of Western philosophy as a suggestion that, we just sort of maybe change the way we emphasize certain things. And that, especially, so if we look at ancient Greek philosophy, it's sort of less clear that something like this strong individualism is even being signed onto. I do think it was something that was really codified during the Enlightenment, and so, insofar as I'm criticizing anyone, it's like certain Enlightenment philosophers who I see as really having bought into this idea of strong individualism. But, it's the same way that, Spinoza might be totally, immune to these criticisms. There may be many other developments in the history of Western philosophy that we could actually pay attention to, and that would be congenial to this way of looking at things.
I was thinking more about how the view you presented relates to Kantian ethics.
Yeah.
Particularly the part that you were talking about at the end. And it seems to me that, like you said, that this idea that there's two different fundamental levels of reality is really important, and how Kant says that there's a sort of contradiction at play when being unethical means to act towards the world in a way that is not reflective of the truth of the world.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's a limitation to how much ethical progress we can make by improving our metaphysics. And are you suggesting that seeing the world in its most true form, or coming to more conclusions about the truth of the world, will inform our ethics? And that's like how we can get to that ethical system?
Yeah, I am suggesting that. I think and actually it's interesting that you brought up the idea of truth, because in Sikh philosophy, truth or sort of truthful living is sort of considered the foremost virtue. And so there is sort of this idea that understanding the true nature of things and being a good person are just one and the same thing when you figure out what each of those things actually entail. And this also gets back to the idea that when you say, when you do something wrong, when you fail to treat someone as having the very same significance that you do, which I think, things like deception and coercion and all the things that we sort of traditionally, in Western philosophy think of as morally wrong. Doing all of those things would actually sort of enact a false representation of reality, and that really is supposed to be a big part of what's going on here. So I think Sikh philosophy is very optimistic about the idea that making ethical progress and figuring out the ultimate nature of reality are one and the same.
My question has to do again with the practical application of this framework, and I think you alluded to the fact that it's hard to grapple with on this plane of reality. But I was wondering how your framework deems the permissibility of inequalities, whether oneness means that all inequalities are unjust, and how that might come into conversation with, for example, the recalcitrance principle.
Good. So there's a certain way of thinking about oneness that would lead to, something like Parfit's impersonal ethics, right? And there we run into, I'm not, forget Parfit for a second, but just think of the kind of, worry where it's like, well, if everyone's kind of the same, then why does it really matter, how things are distributed, or, whether benefits sort of accrue to one person or another. As a matter of fact, it seems like, again, here, this is just drawing on parts of Sikh philosophy that I didn't talk about here. That's not the more specific stuff that's said, it's there's a bunch of stuff that is said about sort of treating people with equality, treating people fairly, stuff like that. It doesn't go nearly into the level of detail that Rawls does about distribution and fairness and equality. So you're not going to find like a specific account of fairness. But what you are going to find is a recognition that fairness and also the way you treat particular people is really important. And again, sort of going back to this idea that we're whatever significance this oneness is supposed to have, it's not that we're all just sort of interchangeable receptacles for some kind of value. So I don't think it's going to get us that kind of consequentialist framework. It's supposed to somehow turn out that we do have these kind of directed obligations, and generally I think that's going to do a better job of making sense of fairness and sort of distributive concerns and stuff like that. But again, you're not going to find, because these aren't, philosophical treatises. It's a bunch of, sort of poetic reflections on the nature of things. You're not going to find anything that within this framework would commit us to, one principle versus another about fair distribution of resources or something like that. There are of course like ways that, people who are Sikhs, like me, tend to live our lives and tend to think of how you should live your lives. But it requires a lot of extrapolation from what's in the text.
Questions over here? Yes. Well, I meant your neighbor, but either,
I was curious as you progressed through your research and are there any other points of Sikhism that can put in conversation with
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I am kind of in the early stages of trying to do this. And it's very difficult to do because there's nothing written about this pretty much, at least nothing in English. And it's just a very different kind of source material. But I guess, so I have, the one paper I published sort of on this stuff, I mean, this talk is a new thing itself, so, hopefully I'll write this into a paper. The one thing I published was about vice and virtue, and in particular focusing on sort of a unified account of vices. I would like to write more about this idea that the sort of fundamental virtue is truthful living, and this idea that sort of truth and morality are the same thing in some sense. That is, and this is a claim that's made many times, but it's not unpacked, as many things are not, unpacked when you're not trying to, write like a philosophical treatise like Western philosophers do. So that would be something that I would be interested in unpacking further, because I think it's actually really important to fill in some of the things that I just was very suggestive about at this time.
Yes.
My questions are more or less similar, but first, have you heard of mass consciousness?
Mass consciousness?
Yeah, so I'm not very learned in philosophy, but I came across this term called mass consciousness, and it kind of seems similar to what you have described with oneness, where it's how everyone's the same. However, with this definition, it seemed like the definition was more negative connotation, where like mass consciousness was instead of being oneness, where you see everyone as equal, you instead see, you kind of fall into what everyone else is doing. And it also kind of seems more linear to like Western ideologies, where oneness is not seen as good, it's like more of an individualistic society. However, I kind of think that there might be like an existing intersection between like the individualism that we perceive in America or like in Western society and this idea of oneness. Do you think it's possible that there's like any way that we can still like preserve our sense of individualism while still pursuing oneness or like at least participating in it?
Yeah, that's a great and very challenging question. If we sort of really take on this perspective, then would we not be able to make sense of the value of things that we consider very valuable, like things that we would put under the heading of being your own person, right? It seems to be important that I am not like everyone else. I have things that I care about are different from the things that other people care about. And sort of how, I guess the question is whether we need strong individualism to make sense of that kind of thing, to make sense of the value of sort of being your own person, of, non-conformity, which seems to be in many cases very valuable. And I think that, again, if we go all the way to a sort of no self kind of view, it gets really, really hard to make sense of the significance of those sorts of things. The hope is that with this two-level picture of reality, you get to sort of, have your cake and eat it too. You can sort of recover the benefits of individuality while also recognizing that because that individuality does not go so deep, we also have a sort of moral constraint on what we do to sort of just pursue our own idiosyncratic ends. And again, what I'm hoping is that this is going to get us something kind of like what we get in Kantian ethics, which is this idea that we have pretty broad latitude to pursue our own sorts of projects and relationships and commitments, but there are strict constraints imposed on the ways in which we can do that. And that latter part of things is sort of what I'm hoping to get out of the framework of oneness, while still recognizing that there is some significance to the fact that we do go around in this world or this level of reality where we are individuals, and where, you know, my consciousness does have boundaries. I mean, that's at least, I think, a fair thing to assume, right? That there is a sort of discrete boundary between my consciousness and that of someone else. And so hopefully insisting on that can help us recover some of those benefits of individualism. So it's the hope is that there's a sort of middle ground between some sort of, you know, hyper communitarian way of looking at things and some sort of hyper individualistic way of looking at things.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Rebecca?
So I want to go back to the two level thing.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of worried about, I guess back to maybe this original question about where morality is operating. So if morality is operating at the fundamental level,
Yeah.
then why isn't the response that you're giving just a version of the self-interest response to why I'm moral? Because if basically I'm one with everyone else, why isn't it just sort of self-interested to be moral because I am the same as everyone else? But which I think gives you all the same sort of implausible things that you had about the self-interest model before, because you've got, you know, the psychological, individual, operating reasons not to be moral. So if morality is operating at that level, I was sort of worried, why is this the version of self-interest?
Yeah.
And if morality is operating at the individual psychological reality level, then you have sort of Thomas's original problem. And if it's operating at both levels, you have this sort of, it feels like you have a kind of a schizophrenia between. So I wonder if maybe what you want to say is that morality operates at in a different way at one level than at the other level, or
So I haven't really fully spelled out the details here. I do want to say I think that it operates at the non-fundamental level, but in virtue of things about the fundamental level. It's supposed to be the idea. I mean, part of what I was trying to do, which I think maybe helps with this sort of worry that, you know, isn't morality still just a form of self-interest? I think if we really take this perspective seriously, then it doesn't really make sense to think about self-interest sort of antecedent to morality the way we tend to. Like this whole idea behind the, you know, constructing morality out of self-interest. It's, okay, so we presuppose that sort of more fundamentally our own interests generate reasons, and then we get the stuff out of that. But, and I haven't fully spelled this out either, it just seems like an odd presupposition to make on a less individualistic framework, on a framework where there isn't this, I mean, there is a separation between individuals, but it doesn't go that deep. And what I'm trying to put my finger on is how that seems to me to really upend this presupposition that we can take self-interest for granted but not morality. And so sort of thinking that, well, you know, there is a sense in which morality can't come apart from self-interest on this framework, but the insofar as that gap is bridged, it's bridged in the other direction, right? What's being explained, you know, you might think that what would be going on this framework is that we're sort of constructing self-interest out of morality rather than the other way around. And to me, that's much less, that bothers me much less than the idea of constructing morality out of self-interest. So again, you know, a lot of kind of vague and suggestive stuff in there, but that's sort of where I think the promise lies, at least.
Okay, so we're not going to be able to get to everyone, which I'm sorry about. Sophia?
Thank you again, and I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on what exact bones there are with this perception of what I understood to be the Buddhist idea of like the rejection of individuality. Because I was thinking of Professor Munoz's question, where I felt like a potential rebuke would be like plagiarism wouldn't even be immoral, because if you think about why plagiarism is immoral, it's because of this idea of like individuality and how we benefit from that individuality. But in a world where you didn't need that individuality in order to survive, then it wouldn't be immoral to do so. So I was wondering, why not reject individuality completely?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very sort of flat-footed answer to that question, but to me, the answer to the question, why not, go all the way to completely rejecting individuality and thinking that it's a complete illusion and there isn't really a self at all, is that if we thought that had moral significance, like in the way you were suggesting, it just seems to get things wrong. Like it just doesn't seem to give us the right results about things. I mean, the question about, with the example about plagiarism, was sort of taking it for granted that it would be wrong to take credit for someone else's work. And the whole, question was how, on a framework of oneness, how can we make sense of, why things aren't just completely interchangeable between people? Because, discrete people don't really exist. So you could go in that direction. There's nothing incoherent about it. I just think that, I guess maybe one way of saying is I'm not sort of trying to upend here the kinds of things, particular things we think of as right and wrong. I'm just trying to give a different sort of indication of why we should care about right and wrong in the first place. And so I'm not even really hoping to get any sort of revisionary implications about what things are right and wrong. I think generally we're on the right track with caring about other people and that whole the whole sort of, because we actually agree on a lot generally about what's right and wrong. And so I'm not really trying to depart from any of that stuff, but just sort of give a different sort of indication of it. And that goal would not be served, I think, by going all the way to this no self kind of extreme.
All right, let's thank our speaker and move on to refreshments.